And let's start with the question, what year were you born?
I was born in January 1931.
January 1931.
About the time the Great Depression was starting.
That's what I was thinking, right. And who's the first president? Which president do you have a first living memory of?
My first living memory is of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt. And what memories do you have of President Roosevelt?
Well, as kids on the farm, we didn't get a radio until about 1920 or 1933 or 34, something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, President Roosevelt's fireside chats were something that we had to sit down and listen to, even though we were young, because my father thought it was important that we at least listen to what the president had to say. And we were trying to live through a very difficult time during the 30s and up prior to the start of World War II.
Was your family much affected by the Depression?
Yes, we lived on a farm as tenant farmers.
You did?
And my dad didn't really own any land until about 1950. But back in the 1930s, we were living on a farm that my grandfather had owned and then lost in the Depression, and moved to town, and we continued to rent that farm for some time.
Okay. And did you work on the farm as a child?
I worked on the farm. I was the oldest of 5 kids.
Wow.
And so there were always chores to do 365 days a year.
Yeah.
So.
And how bad was it for your family? I mean, was it sometimes...
We really didn't have any money,
Yeah.
but we had food because we lived on the farm and raised chickens and pigs and cattle, and always milked certain cows, some cows. And so big gardens were a thing that everybody had, and my mother did a lot of canning of things for... we seldom went into town. We lived about 5 miles from town, and we seldom went into town except on Saturday nights for what things that they needed to buy, and on Sundays always went to church. Although at different times we lived on different farms, so as far as 12 miles away from town.
Wow.
And 5 miles another place.
Yeah.
And so, but we really didn't realize how things were because most of our neighbors on the farm were in the same situation we were.
So it seemed normal.
And so it was a...
Yeah. Did your family support President Roosevelt's New Deal program?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so your family were...
And as new things developed, such as REA and some of the... Well, that's the first electricity we had when I was about 6 or 7 years old.
Was that the Rural Electrification?
Rural Electrification Association.
Yeah.
And
did that bring...
one of Roosevelt's many things that he started at that point.
How old were you when electricity came to your home?
About 6, I think it was.
Yeah.
Before that, we had no electricity, and we had a telephone. We actually got a newspaper, a weekly newspaper, but many of our neighbors didn't, and so we didn't throw away the newspapers. We passed them on to others.
Pass it around
in the community.
So you remember hearing President Roosevelt's voice on the radio?
Oh yes.
Do you agree with people who say that he on the radio had a very sort of fatherly presence?
Yes, that's sort of the way I remember him, and I even remember the day I heard that he died in Georgia,
1945.
Georgia.
Yeah.
So
wow.
Certain things you never forget.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. You were 10 years old when Pearl Harbor happened.
Yes.
What memories do you have of that day, December 7th, 1941?
We actually went to church that morning and heard about it in the afternoon by radio.
And I'm sorry, where were you living at the
We
time?
were living in central Iowa,
Central
South
Iowa.
central Iowa,
Okay.
a place called Pella,
Yeah.
which was a community founded by the Dutch as a religious community back in 1846, I guess it was, the year before Iowa became a state.
Wow. So you were living there, you went to church, and then in the afternoon you heard about Pearl Harbor.
And we heard about it that afternoon, and
How did the news come to you?
by radio.
Okay. And were you just walking through the house and happened to hear it, or did someone call you to the radio and tell you to?
I think someone called and said turn on the radio because the president Pearl Harbor has been bombed.
Yeah.
And that was on December 7.
41.
The other thing that happened about the 19th of December, just a couple of weeks later, my one grandfather passed away of a brain hemorrhage.
Oh boy.
And so that the start of the war and losing a grandfather was all pretty much the same time.
You've kind of linked those things in your mind.
At least in my memory.
Sure. Yeah.
I was the oldest child in the family, and
Yeah.
so
At that time, did you know where Pearl Harbor was?
we just knew about Hawaii, which was one of the American possessions. It wasn't, of course, a state
Right.
until
Yeah.
50 or many years later.
Sure. Now, you're only 10 years old, so you're probably not paying a whole lot of attention to international news, but did you know beforehand that there were problems brewing in the Pacific between the United States and Japan?
Mostly by following a newspaper.
Okay.
Newspapers were important at that time because we didn't have a lot of other communication. And we didn't have a radio, actually,
Right.
until probably about 1935 or 36.
Right.
So newspapers were much more important at that time.
Yeah.
But
And as a child, did you read the newspaper or scan it?
well, I didn't really start school until 1936.
Really? Yeah.
But
okay.
it was important in the
that's right,
family,
yeah.
and of course the folks read the newspaper
Right.
from the time.
Yeah.
But
And I imagine at that time, because of course the war had started in Europe in 1939, I imagine most of the news had to do with the
we
war
knew
in
about
Europe.
that because my mother had some cousins who still lived in Holland, and in 1940, May of 1940, the Germans overran the Dutch.
Right.
It took 3 or 4 days, 5 days maybe,
Yeah.
and they were overrun. And we didn't really know what happened to the relatives
Wow.
because we didn't have communications the way we have today. And it was only after the war we found out that most of them had survived, but they lived under Nazi
That's
occupation until 1945,
Right.
until the war ended
That's
in
right.
Europe
Yeah.
on VE Day.
Yeah. How did the country change? So, you know, when the war begins in 39, and of course there's a lot of debate in this country, the America First Committee, and now you're a child, so I don't expect that you would have a personal memory of these things, but there's a lot of debate about we should stay out of the war, we should help the British, but of course Pearl Harbor happens and the debate goes away.
Well,
Now, in your experience, I mean, how did the country change? Once the US was
communications
in
is
the
a big
war?
thing.
Yeah.
We didn't have television. We didn't have a lot of things we have today.
Right.
And so it was, we didn't hear about some of these things immediately.
Right.
And by having a newspaper at that time, which was very important, we could hear we could see what was happening. But it was mostly what's happened to our relatives. I lived in a community called Pella, Iowa,
Right.
which was founded by the Dutch. And so there were a lot of people in our community had family and relatives in Holland.
Right.
And we knew that the Germans had overrun them, and some, of course, had been killed, and the Germans, the Dutch tried to stop the Germans by flooding many of the fields, and so even some of the livestock, because Holland has a lot of cattle and so on,
Right.
drowned at that time.
Sure.
So, but we really didn't know a whole lot about it because there was really very little communication, and
you're so far away. You know,
and we're
people.
a long way
people-
away. But we,
Yeah.
because we have a connection there,
Right.
that was a little closer than
Right.
having the kind of community. Today, of course,
Sure.
we have almost instant communication, so you
Right.
know what's happening all over the world
That's right.
in a
yeah.
matter of hours,
Yeah.
and so.
Now, people who were children during the Second World War tell me that they tell me how almost regardless of age, everybody was involved in the war effort. when it comes, is that true?
It's
Is
true
that
because
with your memory?
there was a united effort on the part of people in this country to stop the Germans, and then of course later the Japanese too. But the first concern was what was happening in Europe, and since, in fact, I live in a community where a lot of people in my childhood spoke Dutch yet.
Is that right? Yeah.
And so
Did you understand Dutch as a
I only
child?
understand a little bit, and my father insisted that we learn English first, and then whatever Dutch we could pick up was great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
they sometimes spoke in Dutch to each other
Uh-huh.
because they didn't want us kids to understand what was happening or
Sure.
what they didn't want us to know. So.
Yeah. As a child, did you participate in, you know, I hear stories of children going door to door, collect. Now you're out in the country, so I don't know if door to door really works, but
even,
going to doors, collecting metal, collecting rubber, collecting paper,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yes, that was something we did, and it was for the war effort, and everybody, even kids, were very much involved. We also had rationing, and we had ration books for each child.
What was rationing?
Rationing meant well, certain things were not available. You couldn't buy, for example, new tires. You couldn't get sugar. You couldn't get a lot of things, and so the government issued ration books, and so if a baby, in our case, as new children were born in the family, then the folks got ration books for us, and then you could buy things with the stamps that were in the ration books, a limited number.
Yeah.
And the same thing was true for gasoline. At one time, when they started out, they had ration books for gasoline for your car, and it was a stamp was worth, I mean, for one stamp you could get 4 gallons of gas. Then it was cut down to 3 and finally 2 for a stamp.
Mm-hmm.
And and I remember a time when our car had a tire blowout, and so we got along with 4 tires on the car. You couldn't have a spare tire at that time. But even as kids, we went to sometimes places where farmers dumped stuff they didn't want, and dug through those old dumps for rubber and for aluminum and for other things. That,
And what did you do with it
we
after
took
you
it into
collected?
town, and usually there was some place where you could deposit it,
Yeah.
and then it was shipped off
Yeah.
to where Defense Works.
And as children, I mean, do you remember even saying something like, you know, well, we can't fight the Germans, but this is how we can help fight the Germans?
Well, yeah, we all felt that we were doing some part, and there was even some antagonistic things that happened because people didn't want to participate or didn't want to get involved, and so we had in our community, well, I shouldn't say our community, I lived outside of town, but there was one Japanese family in town.
Oh.
And they didn't have a very easy time of it because they were looked upon as enemies
Is that right?
in those days. So
And was that a change? Had they got along fine before the war, but then after the war?
they were kids our age, and their parents, and they worked in a factory in our community. The husband and but they continued to live there until the children eventually were went through school and went on to college. So
Yeah. But now, since they lived in Iowa, then they were not, of course, Japanese on the West Coast were put into detention camps, but these Japanese were living in Iowa and therefore were
in
not.
the community throughout the war. So
Yeah. But you feel like life did become a little more difficult for them.
it was because they were sort of looked down upon because they were Japanese, and at the same time we knew about the fact that on the coast they pretty much sent the Japanese and so on into camps, even as close as Arkansas here. They
That's right.
brought some of them here to
right.
Fort. Well, let's see, much.
Jerome, I think one of the spots was Jerome.
We had some German prisoners of war also who were kept in Iowa during the war.
Is that right?
And in fact, some of them after the war chose to stay in Iowa.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. Did you ever happen to run into any of them?
No, because we didn't actually travel that far. And
okay.
I mean, they were not in our community.
Yeah.
There were, I think, 2 or 3 camps in Iowa that had German prisoners of war.
Yeah. How would you describe the spirit of things? So, for example, just as a hypothetical situation, before the war, Johnny has 10 pieces of candy a week. Now the war starts, Johnny gets 2 pieces of candy a week. Is Johnny okay with that? Because Johnny knows that the sugar's going to the guys fighting the war, and therefore this is my sacrifice for the war.
I think there was almost, in our community anyway, universal, what can we do to help? And if we have to have certain things rationed, that's okay, because it's for the war effort. Even buying stamps, which are called, well, there are different kinds of stamps, but you put them in a stamp book, and that was often done at schools.
Yeah.
So in our schools we had, and you know, nobody had a whole lot of money, so there wasn't a whole lot done, but it was a feeling of we're doing this for the war effort.
People who lived through that time tell me that in their memory, the country was never as united before and has not been as united since. That during the Second World War, the country is absolutely united. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a sort of a community by community did all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of women who went to work in factories and other jobs that they hadn't done before, because but I lived on a farm, and that was different than if you lived in a small community.
Yeah.
And the community I lived at that time was probably less than 5,000. Today it's only about 10,000 yet.
Wow.
So it's still not a large community in Iowa. So,
did you happen to know any who did serve overseas who did not survive?
Yes, there were probably about 10 guys in our community who were killed during the war.
Right?
Some were pilots. After the war, some of them on Saturday evenings would gather at the bandstand after the band and tell about their experiences in prisoner of war camps or in their battlefield experience and so on.
Wow.
And they were pretty well attended because a lot of people wanted to know. We had another censorship thing was a big thing during World War II too. And so we didn't often hear what was happening. It was only after the war that some of these things came out. For example, we didn't really know about the German gathering of the Jews and exterminating Jews. We only learned about that after the war.
Do you know what do you think about that looking back? Because I've talked to World War II veterans who talk about the censorship, and they say that they think it was a good thing. Not censorship related to the Holocaust, as you were saying, but censorship in relation to detailed reporting of battle, because they say if the American people knew what was actually happening over here in terms of battle, in terms of the carnage, they would not put up with it. That censorship was something that needed to be in place so
Yeah.
that we could actually prosecute
Now, I
this
felt
war.
the same way, that
You feel
even
that?
though you could write letters, the letters that came back were also often censored, so anything, loose lips sink ships was
Famous
some
phrase.
small little
Sure.
things that, now
Yeah.
I was younger during that time. I was actually 14 when the war ended. So,
Yeah.
but it was, in my life before that, with seeing what was going on was important. So,
Sure. Yeah. What memories do you have of, or do you have memories of? There's Victory in Europe Day, which comes in, if I remember right, May of '45.
yeah.
And then there's Victory in Japan Day, which comes in August '45. Do you have any memories of Victory in Europe Day?
Yes,
What do you remember about
we
that?
were so thankful because we began to wonder what happened to our relatives that were living in Holland, especially at that point.
Yeah.
And we didn't really find out until later that year. And then we had clothing drives. Some of the relatives let us know that they had barely escaped from the German occupation,
Yeah.
and they needed things. And so I remember my father sent, among other things, his wedding suit to Europe after the war, so that some of the relatives could,
Wow.
use some of the stuff that had been taken from them by the Germans.
Boy, that's something.
Um,
I believe in the Netherlands there was even starvation as well.
oh, there were some people who died of starvation. Yes.
Yeah, toward the end of the war. Were there, when victory over Germany was announced, do you remember, were there church services? Were there bells ringing? What sorts of memories do you have of
All
that?
of those things.
Yeah.
We actually had prayer services toward the end of the war,
Yeah.
and there were celebrations, especially because of the VE Day in May
Right.
of '45.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the people who lives here in Concordia was very thankful that VE Day came, but they were getting ready to go to Japan, and at that time we were taking islands in Japan, or fighting for islands,
Right.
Guadalcanal and some of the others,
Right.
headed for Tokyo,
Right.
and so they were very thankful when things ended in August, because
Oh.
they were preparing, some of the people actually had been in Europe were being prepared to go over to Japan.
Back up a little bit. Again, you were young, so some of the details might escape you. But do you happen to remember D-Day?
D-Day, yes. That was
Yeah.
because we lost some people from our community who died at Normandy.
How about VJ Day? So now we're there in August
I remember
45.
that again because on the farm we had thrashing in August. I think it was August 14, but I'm not positive.
Yeah.
But that day, the message came by radio again that the war had ended, and we quit early that day, and we went into town that night with our cars as kids and so on, and drove around the square and blowing the horns and had quite a celebration. And but the gas rationing was still on at that time, so
Right.
you couldn't do a whole lot of things. But anyway,
That's
it was
Wow.
something I still remember because we quit early to be able to go into town and celebrate that night by driving around making noise.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, since the Second World War, there's been a lot of thinking about the atomic bombs and and all that. At the time, in August 1945, September 1945, do you remember, people having second thoughts about the atomic bomb, or was it pretty straightforward at that time?
It was pretty straightforward, and
Yeah.
almost everybody in our communities thought it was the right decision by the president, even
Yeah.
though a lot of people died, a lot of innocent people died.
Yeah.
That was the idea of having to take islands all the way to Japan,
Yeah.
and many more being killed that way. At that time, there was no real second question about,
Yeah.
well, this is the wrong thing to do. It was sort of, this is the right thing to do, get this war stopped.
So let's fast forward then. So World War II is over in 1945, and then in right about 5 years later, July 1950, then North Korea invades South Korea. At that time in 1950, you'd been through high school. If somebody said, "Oh, South Korea's just been invaded," did you have any idea where South Korea was at that time?
No, we just knew it was out somewhere near Japan.
Okay, somewhere out there. Yeah, and so
And then, of course, by that time, we had gone through the draft of World War II. In fact, my father in the early 1942, 43 was on a list of people who might be drafted, which was of great concern.
Yeah.
Although he never did get drafted, and but they were taking people in the draft up to age 35, and he was about that age in World War II, and so we were concerned that he might be drafted, which would have to leave the farm and so on.
Well,
but that never happened, for him anyway.
Yeah. Now, what year did you go into the Army?
I went into the Army. I enlisted in the Iowa National Guard in 1951.
In 1951. Okay.
And so I knew I was of the age I could be drafted. And during World War II, the Iowa and Nebraska National Guards had been activated as units. And we thought that would probably happen again in 1951 or 52. And so I was a member of the Iowa National Guard, but then they changed the rules on us, and so they began drafting out of the National Guard into the regular Army, and that's what happened to me at that time. So
that's what happened to you.
I went into active duty out of the National Guard into the infantry, and I was sent to Camp Polk, Louisiana. Went down Highway 71,
Yeah.
within a mile of where I live right now, onto Louisiana, where I was trained as an infantry squad leader. So
this was 1951?
well, this is 1953 when I was drafted finally.
Okay.
51 or 52, I was in the National Guard. 53 to 55, I was on active duty in the Army. So
now the war in Korea keeps going through the summer of '53. Were you assuming after you were activated into active service, were you assuming that Korea was your destination?
I wasn't just assuming. They told us, you guys are going to Korea.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of learn what you need to learn because you're going to be on fighting in Korea. Well,
I'm going.
as it turned out, most of my company did go to Korea. And this would have been in about June, May, June of 53.
Yeah, yeah.
And it didn't really, the fighting didn't really stop until July
Right.
of 53.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but I wasn't concerned at that point because I'd already been moved out of the active force into a reserve, I shouldn't say reserve, but a service company. And because of being able to type, and then they sent me to school in Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana.
Right.
And from there back to Camp Polk, and then to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I finished.
Yeah. So you ended up not actually going overseas, you ended up staying in the States.
Yeah, well, I was safe because the 5 or 6 of us who had been picked out for being typists were...
Right.
At that time, the Army said, we need typists, we need... And so, out of the 100 and some guys in our outfit, in our company,
Right.
I think 5 or 6 of us.
Yeah, yeah. What I want to ask you about now is, and I think I may have misspoke earlier. I think I may have said the war in Korea started in July 50. It started in June 50, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right, June 50.
Yeah, June 1950. But You were saying a little while ago that during the Second World War, the country was so united and the kids are involved and everybody's working. And then Korea comes, and it's not that long after, it's only 5 years after. And yet the Korean conflict is remembered as the forgotten war. What? How do you make sense of that? You lived through that period, you were in the military during the Korean War. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I think that the thoughts, the memories of World War II were still hanging over most people. And this didn't seem like, well, they called it police action at first, rather than Korean War.
Yeah.
But it was not really a police action, it was far more than that, and it was also, the United Nations were involved at that point. We hadn't had a United Nations before 1945. And so by 1950, there was an effort on the United Nations forces that actually, including mostly Americans, but a lot of others too.
Right.
And so,
so are you saying that it, although, the U.S. is heavily involved, it kind of doesn't feel like our war though, because it's technically a United Nations war?
well, for those who were involved, it was sort of our war, but
Yeah.
because it wasn't nearly as widespread, and it was also under kind of United Nations guidance, leadership. It was a different feeling than in World War II, where we were really out to get the Germans and the Japs.
Sure. And there was a feeling, although, we look back now and maybe, it was overblown, but there was a feeling at the time that, Germany and Japan, were at least at times actual threats to the United States. I don't think anyone said North Korea might invade California or something like that. So maybe it didn't feel as dangerous.
No, it didn't seem that, but for those of us who were involved, it was another war.
What kind of work did you do in a typical work day when you were active duty Army?
In the personnel office, it was a matter of, I was actually in charge of 4 other guys in the officer record section. And so we interviewed officers coming and going in Fort Riley, Kansas. And I had to contact any changes we made to their records had to be sent that day to the Pentagon. So I was got a security clearance, and I had to contact the Pentagon each day. So
to get permission to make changes in the records.
Any change that was made in officer records, and so we had a copy. The Pentagon had a copy each day of any change that was made. So, and sometimes we had officers come back from Korea, for example, without a record because they'd been destroyed, or they'd been captured, or they'd been injured in some way, wounded, and so they were taken from the battlefield to various hospitals and recovery places.
Yeah.
And so they sometimes came to Fort Riley, Kansas without any records. So we had to build a whole new record for them. And
wow, would that involve having then to contact other bases to?
Well, often it was a matter of trying to find out from what actually happened in Korea, how they were wounded, and how long they were in recovery periods. So I know one of my friends was injured the first night he was in combat.
Wow. Yeah.
Hand grenade came into their bunker, and as he was taught, he grabbed the thing to throw it out, and as he started to throw it, it took his arm off, and he had shrapnel in his body, which he still has today.
Wow.
They didn't dig all of it out.
Wow.
But in fact, at a school class reunion, I guess maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, he was telling me that he had this sore on his heel, and he went into the VA hospital in Chicago, and here was a piece of steel
Wow.
that had worked its way down his leg and out his heel, and once it got it out, it healed up again. But
Wow.
but he's still carrying other pieces of steel in his body. But his hand, they gave him an artificial arm, and he became
Wow.
a teacher, as I did.
Wow. And you and I are speaking in 2021, and he's still with us, but he's
He's 92 years old now.
still has shrapnel in his body from the Korean War.
And he still has, of course, he got his education, same as I did, through the GI Bill.
Yeah.
And he has had his medical things taken care of ever since his wounding. But he married a girl I once dated,
Wow.
and they had, I think, 5 kids.
Wow.
So he's lived a fairly normal life, but he still has, well, he wears his hook most of the time. He has an artificial hand too, but he prefers the hook, so anyway.
I wonder if that's what he started with that, and that's what he's just sort of used to.
I'm not sure. He just found it more convenient to use the hook than to use the artificial hands and the fingers.
Wow.
Now we're going back to a time in the early 50s where things were not the way they are today. Today the artificial limbs are much more useful than they were back in the time when he was wounded.